Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. If you look at the thumbnail, there's going to be two guests in this podcast. So, no, you're not on the wrong episode. He's going to be joining in a little bit. We're going to be joined by Sam Perroni about his book that talks a lot about the Natalie Wood death. And Brad, you have an interest in the Natalie Wood death. I didn't know about this until after I had Sam Perroni on. You had messaged me. Most of our conversations have been about JFK, but can you maybe introduce me to how you began looking into the Natalie Wood death, or you thought it was interesting?
Well, I haven't really done a formal review like Sam has done or a lot of other authors. I'm certainly not qualified to write a book on it. The thing is that you've got to remember this is 1981 that this happened. There was no internet. There was no 24-hour news cycle. There was, the television went off at midnight. And in those days, celebrity news a lot of times came from tabloids. And I remember, prior to her death, it seemed like, we'd be in, I was 6 years old when this happened. And we'd be in line at the supermarket and it was Robert and Natalie this, Robert and Natalie that. And everything seemed just fine. And then all of a sudden she's dead. And in print they have to be very, very careful in how they say things. But I looked at a couple of those and had the impression, even at that very young age, that the tabloid at least was insinuating that he had something to do with it. They didn't outright come out and say, yeah, he's the most likely person because he's probably going to sue him for libel. But it was one of those. There's a few things in my childhood that stand out. The first one probably is the death of John Lennon. This is probably number two.
Wait, John Lennon's dead?
I hope so. Otherwise, you've had David Whalen on here for no reason. That's another great book, by the way.
That John Lennon? Holy shit, not kidding.
Yeah. But no, at most on commercial media, what you would get would be Walter Cronkite coming on saying, and Natalie Wood, film star, has passed away in an apparent boating accident. And that would be the end of it. It was not anything that you would expect. Now they'd have 48 hours episodes and Nancy Grace would be jumping up and down on stuff and all this stuff. But in those days, I vividly remember these, because the covers, you go to the supermarket and there's several of them in a row. And it seemed like there were three people you could count on being on a tabloid in those days. Robert and Natalie Wood Wagner, and whoever Elizabeth Taylor was married to that week. Those were the biggies in those days. This was before, Michael Jackson, and, that really opened up a lot of the more mass media stuff when Jackson came along in the mid 80s. But prior to that, your news sources were rather shifty at best. Which is why I always thought it was funny in the Men in Black that Tommy Lee Jones called the tabloids some of the greatest investigative reporting on the planet. And maybe it was, but no, it's always been something I've never really set out to read every book on it. I've certainly watched the documentaries as they've come out. I've seen interviews with her sister, and then Sam, when he issued that book, I just thought, wow, that's really going to be a game changer. And unfortunately, haven't had time to get all the way through it, but it certainly is. It's well documented, and I would recommend it to any. If you're watching the show, if you're interested enough to click on the show, you're probably interested enough to read the book.
It's a very well documented book. It's a subject I didn't really know about Natalie Wood, obviously, until I was coming across a list of mysterious deaths. And you get down the rabbit hole, and then I clicked on Natalie Wood's name, and then found out she was this famous actress that died. Not only that, but number two from Goldmember was like the main
Oh yeah.
suspect of the whole thing. I was like, oh my God, you know how many times I've seen that movie and my dad's never bothered to mention, hey, did you know he's involved in like an unsolved murder case or mysterious death case?
Yeah.
But this is a subject, much like a lot of people bring up, is that when a celebrity dies, some people just can't deal with it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm curious on what your thoughts would be to that, because obviously that's well, I think, established. And I think even with autopsy changes of her death, there's a lot of circumstances surrounding her death that are unexplainable. There's conflicting accounts, and there hasn't been really serious questioning brought to certain people like Robert Wagner or Christopher Walken. I mean, I've seen one interview with him where he talked about it maybe in the 80s or 90s, but I think this boils into probably what we'll discuss with Sam, which is the connectedness of Hollywood and what could be covered up
Yeah.
and what is, I don't know, I wouldn't say scandalous, but you were right in saying about magazines and tabloid magazines. As much as they joke around and they're kind of trash, Playboy did really good interviews with like Fidel Castro and Martin Luther King back in the
Oh
day.
yeah.
So like they do have some bit of seriousness to it. Now, was that title of Natalie Wood's death being suspicious and it was Robert Wagner? Was it to get buys? Probably. But I think it's well accepted amongst a lot of people now that I see in the comments that a lot of people are still like, it was Wagner. And they want Wagner to finally say something because he's not going to be around forever. So obviously, I gave you a whole list of questions here. But when we talk about the loss of a celebrity, how is this different in your mind?
This one, I don't know. John Lennon's was more, and I was 5 when that happened. It was not quite a year between the two deaths. Um, Lennon's was a homicide. And, you shouldn't have been probably at that age, but you watch TV and you see some guy on a TV show shoot someone. Well, you can wrap your head around that. But I felt even back then that Robert Wagner was probably the most likely person. And the idea to a 6-year-old that a husband would off his wife, very strange. It's like, it wasn't too long after that Marvin Gaye was murdered. And who shot him? His father. You don't expect family members or spouses to turn on each other like that. And for a 6-year-old, that's kind of don't get me wrong. I've never had a fear of my parents, but you go, wow, that happens in families. Everything up to now seemed to have been just unicorns and puppies, and everything was wonderful. And it really it did feel at the time. Again, I was 6. These are impressions that I'm pulling up for the first time in a lot of years. But it seemed like at the time that Wagner didn't want anything to do with the media. Of course I didn't know about Walken or DeVerne. I Because as a 6-year-old, you go, well, okay, husband and wife on a boat, whatever. Um, but there was a distinct lack of witnesses that seemed to be around. And now, of course, I know that probably initially, at least, when an investigation is ongoing, they really don't like the star witnesses to go blabbing to the media. But after a time, you kind of go, "Wow, why isn't this guy talking?" One of the surprising things that you'd mentioned, the autopsy. One of the surprising things to me was the revelation that 2 other pathologists were present at that autopsy. I always thought, and I read Coroner when I was probably 8 or 9 years old.
By Thomas Taguchi.
Yeah, my mom had purchased that book, and it had a lot of cases in it. It had, I believe, John Belushi and Janis Joplin and whoever else like it's been a long time since I saw that book. But I tend to think of. I noticed your reaction on your first show when he mentioned that Noguchi was sort of the man of the hour during that time.
Well, we're Kennedy guys. We look at him like that's our best example of like RFK conspiracy. But then you look at the Natalie Wood thing, and Sam Perroni's
And
like,
now
no,
it's
he's a terrible guy.
yeah, and that was a bit of an eye opener for me. I always thought, I'd always heard that the show Quincy, which again referring to television, but being a child, thinking back on those childhood memories, I have limited reference points. But the show Quincy, where Jack Klugman played this all-star coroner who couldn't get anything wrong, that supposedly was based on Thomas Noguchi. Um, but to hear that, there's stuff like the scratch in the midline of the throat that didn't make the report, but yet he's concerned enough to bring in people who can examine that throat and be more competent than he is himself. That was a real eye opener for me because I just always thought that he did it.
What Sam introduced was that the two pathologists that were called to work with Thomas Noguchi were strangulation and like domestic, like stuff that would be like domestic violence cases. You would bring these people in. It's like you wouldn't bring those people in if you didn't think that there was a case. And obviously, they have to rule that out in something like this. But I think there was a lot of evidence to support, and I think that's where you even got Frank Sinatra came out, which was surprising to me, and made a statement to that Thomas Noguchi should be seen, not heard. Like we need the credentials of Thomas Noguchi, but he should keep his mouth closed because he doesn't know what he's talking about.
And then you go, well, about showing us your credentials, Mr. Sinatra. But yeah, and to me, when you've got a megastar kind of Hollywood super couple, if she had been married to just some nobody, maybe you know some guy who was not in show business, maybe it would have come out under the same circumstances where they were on a yacht and it was a fight and she ended up perishing. But where he was a star as well, now the media, they've got to pick who are we gonna protect here? Are we gonna look out for Natalie's interests, or are we gonna be scared and do whatever the Wagner camp wants us to do? Now, I saw a film probably 6 or 8 months ago called Midway from 1976. So we're looking at 5 years difference. Now, his career in the movies was not that great at the time of his that's occurred. To a movie star, resorting to television is in fact resorting to television. Most people would rather do films. But in this film, which was, of course, about the Battle of Midway, you've got Robert Mitchum, you got Henry Fonda, you've got all these huge people. Robert Wagner played a junior officer. But I was amazed when I saw that film, and I've never really been a huge Wagner fan, but I was surprised at how few lines he had. And then when Sam started talking about motive, well, his career maybe wasn't what it should be, and there's money involved and all this stuff, that I thought, well, that movie Midway does kind of back that up a little bit. That you've got he did well enough to get cast in this film with a cavalcade of huge celebrities. But I mean, and I should have rewatched the film last night, but it seemed like he had a handful of lines. And to go from being, I remember a film from the 60s that he was in. I can't recall what it was. He played a Marine, but he was the star of that film, to slowly having that career drop. And then suddenly you've got, six, eight, 10 lines in this movie. Um, a serious downstep, or a setback for him with his movie career.
Yeah, you're examining motive evidence of why he would kill Natalie Wood, and that would be he obviously didn't like being second in his own marriage and second in his own career path. So I mean, it's good motive. I mean, you could definitely see that with a lot of egotistical actors back in the day.
Oh yeah, and I not to deride actors, but I think that anybody who feels confident enough that they want to get up and be seen by the public, and here's 2 hours of me on the screen. There's an element
What
of
the hell are we doing here, Brad? Come on now.
this is a little different. Um, but like last night, I watched Rebel Without a Cause, and I was struck by, even at 17 or whatever she was, um, very confident, very believable. Probably, James Dean was really good, but she was certainly on his level. Sal Mineo, and interestingly enough, the three key stars in that film, Sal Mineo, Natalie Wood, and James Dean, none of them died of old age. They all died prematurely. Um, but no, she was. Sam had mentioned that they called her One Take Natalie, and I could definitely see that she had what it took. Now I would be curious what Wagner's take record was.
Yeah.
Is he someone that takes 10 takes to get a scene down, or I don't know, but
Did you ever think it was weird that even when his own daughters asked about the murders or the deaths, he really never gave them a good answer? Kind of never gave them any. He's never really elaborated even to his own family about that night.
yeah, and I think that I was surprised that they even asked the question. But when they did ask the question, because if he'd have told them that he'd done it, they probably would have omitted it altogether. But for them to ask that in a public forum like that really was kind of surprising to me, that that could happen, and that he would just skirt the answer. Just he's never had any interest in it. And I saw a clip of Christopher Walken a few days ago where someone asked him about it, and he said, I quit talking about that in the '80s, and you're thinking, wow, these people, for instance, with the Kennedy thing or Martin Luther King or whatever, the people that are still alive, most of them still talk about it. They'll still answer questions and all that. But these two guys clammed up, and DeVerne, I don't know how believable he is.
I like to trust some of his statements, but it's something we'll get into with Sam because I'm sure he's experienced it. It's a lot like our experience through the JFK community. There's a lot of gatekeeping in this communities. Obviously, everyone has their own independent theory of how it happened or who did what or who's involved or who's the culprit. Surprisingly, it's the same thing with Natalie Wood's scenario. There's a lot of people that believe it was Walken. A lot of people believe that was Wagner. A lot of people believe that it was some type of money ploy or some type of Hollywood scandal type thing. It might be multifactorial. We don't know. All that we can really say is that with Natalie Wood, there's a lot of questions about like when they went out to eat the night before, and apparently Wagner was in a pissed off mood. The dinghy I think, hadn't even been started and somehow drifted away from the yacht, and then she's found like in an aisle somewhere. There's a lot of suspicions of her outfit or attire, everything she was wearing when the night she did go in. The scratches on the dinghy, her fingernails under it were never checked, which in a lot of cases fingernails are checked under during an
Oh,
autopsy.
most of the time, yeah. I mean, I've attended autopsies, even with natural deaths. And, like Sam pointed out, homicide 101, or I guess you could call criminal investigation 101. Until you're proven otherwise, you treat it as a homicide. And part of that includes fingernail scraping. Um, but no, it really was surprising to me, all the stuff, you hear this or that, um, but to see it all compiled in this tremendous book that Sam has put together is he's got a pretty solid case there.
And we're joined by Mr. Perroni. For everyone out there listening, if for everyone out there listening, if you see Sam reading, it's because he has a hearing issue, so he's reading captions. So we're going to talk a little slow and make sure he can understand the questions that we're asking and get some really good answers from him for the work that he has done. But Mr. Perroni, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Me and Brad just recorded a little bit before you got here, and we're going to start talking a little bit more about some of the evidence to suggest, obviously, foul play with Natalie Wood, because in any of these scenarios, celebrity deaths, you have people that there's a theory that goes out there that some people just can't get over losing someone they felt so close to. But in obviously Natalie Wood's case, there's a lot of things that are errors or red flags that should be brought up. The fact that her autopsy certificate was changed to kind of like an unresolved death.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. I've had the pleasure of being on your show before. You're an excellent host, and I look forward to some great questions. And yes, you have made an excellent point there with what you've discerned from reading my book about celebrity deaths. And I think you're probably right. I think it probably pertains to just about every celebrity death. Things aren't handled the same way. Now, let me say this. Because of social media, Facebook, YouTube, all that kind of thing, it's kind of changing a little bit. A lot of these charges that are filed against celebrities these days, in the old days, they would have been swept under the rug in 2 seconds. The fixers in the studios would have contacted the police, and they would have taken care of it because it happened. And it even happened with death cases. I mean, like hit and run cases and drunk driving, killing somebody cases. So it wasn't just confined to like traffic violations. They try to take care of the celebrities because the celebrities bring a lot of money to Los Angeles and California. And so, but in today's day, it's a lot harder for them to do that.
Could you maybe talk about some of the red flags on Natalie's body during the autopsy that was recorded? Obviously, marks on the backs of her legs and the throat wound that would obviously get a lot of people who might not have heard your past episodes to get to the level of foul play with Natalie Wood.
Right. If you look at the official autopsy report, and I want everyone out there to be careful, because if you go online and you punch in autopsy report, it's going to show you the autopsy report for Natalie Wood. Don't ask me when it got on the internet, because I don't know. But it's not the complete report. However, what is online is the narrative portion of the autopsy report. And what's interesting about the narrative portion of the autopsy report is that it does not mention some of the things that I'm about ready to talk to you about. It basically brushes off the bruises on Natalie Wood's body. And the reason why I know the number at least is because in the autopsy report, and this is probably also attached to, there are posterior and anterior diagrams of Natalie's body. And when they perform an autopsy, and I've seen 3 autopsies, so I know what I'm talking about here. When they perform the autopsy, what happens is the doctor is either dictating what he sees as he's performing the autopsy, or an assistant or someone is taking notes. And back in 1981, I think that in Natalie's case, that one of the pathologists, Dr. Choi, was the one making the notes during the autopsy report. And I think Dr. Choi was the primary forensic pathologist on the case. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the head of the department, was there. And there was also another a pathologist there that we can talk about. But he was the one making the notes, and he made these notes. And the reason I believe that is in the full autopsy report, there is at the back of it, there is 3 or 4 pages of handwritten notes. It's kind of like a little diary. And back there, Dr. Choi has made some notes and signed it, Dr. Choi. Well, the handwriting in the back is the same as the handwriting on the diagrams. So that's why I believe that Dr. Choi did this. Well, what happened was on the diagram, when Dr. Choi was doing it, he noted, for example, a scratch right in the middle of Natalie's throat, right there. But if you go read the narrative portion of the autopsy report, which Dr. Noguchi said he did, that part's left out. Now, in the autopsy report, it also states that there was an examination of Natalie's throat. Well, the reason why there was an examination of Natalie's throat is because when they saw that scratch in the middle of her throat, they thought that perhaps she could have been strangled or choked to death. And so they did a complete autopsy on Natalie's throat, looking on the inside of her throat and on the outside. And the report says they didn't note any damage. But let me say this about that. Just because there's no notation of no damage doesn't necessarily mean that Natalie wasn't grabbed by the throat and that a fingernail or a thumbnail made the scratch on her throat. That's why I've always contended that it was intentional, that they did not get any fingernail scrapings or clippings from DeVerne, Wagner, and Walker. In an ordinary case, I can tell you that if there were 4 people on a boat, a beautiful starlet, and 3 men, and she ended up in the water, they would have been taking fingernail scrapings and clippings from every one of those guys, and they would have examined every one of them for scratches, bruises, and other things. So the biggest thing on Natalie's body that was a red flag was this scratch in the middle of her throat. And the reason why I say that is they did not do any investigation of that scratch. Now, somebody might say, well, how in the world do you do an investigation of a scratch? Well, here's how you do it. You take a scalpel and you take the skin off around it all the way down to where you're below the level of the depth of the scratch. They can see the depth of the scratch just by a normal examination. They go down all the way down and they take that little piece of skin with that scratch on it and they put it in one of their super duper high velocity microscopes, and they can see exactly what happened in that scratch. And I believe they could tell you that it was made by a fingernail or a thumbnail. They took examples, they took sections of the bruises on Natalie's body, which I will talk about in a minute, and did look at them under that super duper microscope. So it's not like they didn't have the equipment. They had the equipment. They just didn't do it. And I think they didn't do it on purpose because they were afraid of where it was going to lead them. Now, the bruises. In the autopsy report, they just kind of fluff off the bruises, like, well, they were just peripheral surface type bruises, just something you might get if you banged your hand on a counter or something. When in truth and in fact, that diagram, if you count them, shows over 30 bruises on Natalie Wood's body. They even say in the autopsy report that some of the bruises that they looked at, and they didn't look at all of them, but the ones they looked at were fresh. That is, they were made within the last 24 hours of her life. So, with respect to bruises and that scratch on her throat, there were big red flags about what happened to Natalie Wood. The last thing is the bruises on the back of her legs. She's in the water. It's very difficult to bruise yourself when you're in the water, in the middle of the ocean. There was nothing around for her to bang her legs on. But in the master stateroom of the yacht, the master stateroom bed had a wooden bed surround. And it was just about the height of Natalie Wood's back legs, where those bruises are. I believe that during the fight between Natalie and Wagner, she bruised her legs by hitting them on that bed surround, the back of her legs. But those were red flags because they were unexplained. They never explained them. Just like they never explained the scratch in the middle of her throat. They just ignored it.
I was curious if you felt that the physical aspect of this dispute had gone on longer than just the incident at dinner, or after dinner rather. But could it have gone on? You mentioned that the bruising had occurred within the previous 24 hours. Could there have been an incident maybe in the afternoon or in the morning that could have contributed to that?
Well, to answer your question, yes, there could have been some other kind of incident or something of that nature that it could have possibly caused a one or two of those front bruises. But the bruises on the back of her legs, in my opinion, there's nothing that she could have done accidentally to bruise the back of her legs like that. Also, there are a couple of bruises on her legs, one on her knee and one on her ankle, that are not bruises, they're contusions. They were made by force. And my belief is those bruises were made at the time that Natalie fell. I believe she sustained those when she fell as she was falling off the yacht. She sustained those. However, there is a bruise that's almost half as long as her forearm on the inside of her arm, right in here. Now, it's pretty hard to accidentally bruise the inside of your forearm unless you got your arm up. And I think that during that fight that they had down in the master stateroom, that Natalie put her forearm up, and that's how she got that bruise. And it's a big bruise, too. It's a contusion, which, according to my expert pathologist, was sustained before she went in the water and had to have been sustained by force. Something hit her there, right? So the question is, well, what hit her? And then you got to answer it. Well, in a normal circumstance, you don't bruise under your arm here, but you do if you're trying to deflect somebody from hitting you. And I believe that Wagner was trying to hit her. And when he did, he hit her forearm because she put her forearm up.
We've talked a lot about motive evidence in your past episodes and a lot about the actual story and the popularity of Natalie Wood. But how much has been revealed through media and documentaries on Natalie Wood? Obviously, me and you have done clips, Sam, on the case, and a lot of stuff like the dinghy having a full tank never being started, witnesses to the scenario or the scene that happened that night all started coming out a little bit later. But this is all important evidence. But obviously, the case for Natalie Wood is still alive and going. But has media done a better job at examining or just keeping the doorway open for the Natalie Wood case as much as other people have? Because even with Dennis DeVerne speaking in a documentary about believing whatever he believes, it's still important. We don't have a lot of that on television or main media sources to keep the story alive.
Well, Robbie, the answer is no. No one except me has ever explored and emphasized and revealed with as much passion as I have the things that I just talked to you about. No one's done that. In addition to the things that we talked about, they also found during Natalie's autopsy spots, blood spots. And they're about over 100 years ago, a pathologist basically wrote about these. And so they started calling them Tardieu spots because his last name was Tardieu. He was a French guy, I believe. She had Tardieu spots on her lungs. Okay, so the question is, well, why? Why would Natalie Wood Wagner, who was only 43 years old, have these unexplained blood spots on her lungs? Well, I did some medical research, and I discovered that if you are in a situation where you are doing a lot of screaming, and I'm talking about serious screaming, you can actually cause blood spots on your lungs. Well, Dennis DeVerne has said there was a screaming, cussing fight that took place in the master stateroom that spilled out on the back deck and went on for some period of time. So that's corroboration of DeVerne's statement. But has the media ever picked up on that and ever said anything? No, no one but people like you, with me sitting on the other side of the camera.
They have the resources to, but obviously through interviews with Walken and interviews with Wagner, interviews with Dennis DeVerne, there's a problem. Walken has wanted to speak about it since the 80s or the brief time he has. And then Wagner, when he's asked questions, they're softball things, and he gives like a same sob story. But nobody's ever really made them sit down and answer tough questions that I'm pretty sure much of the community, much of your work has raised that are real general questions that should be answered in a specific form.
Well, you are exactly right. the media has let Walken off the hook. He has over the years, he's given 2 or 3 interviews. In those interviews, he's lied. He lied to the sheriff's detectives when he was interviewed on 2 occasions in Los Angeles in 1981, immediately after Natalie's death. And people know that he's lied, but yet they do not want to confront him with it. And it just totally puzzles me over why the mainstream media isn't more intent on getting the truth out of Walken, because Walken heard that screaming, banging, cussing fight. I promise you, his room was only about 25 feet from Natalie and Wagner's room. And DeVerne said he was up in his perch, surrounded by ensign glass. So he wasn't even in the yacht. He was up in his little high perch, and he could hear all this. So if he could hear it up there, Walken could hear it in his stateroom, where everyone, including Walken, says he was. Now, initially, Walken told magazines and the police, or the sheriff, that he was asleep when it happened and that he slept all night long. Basically, he said he took himself out of the picture. One of the reporters called it the perfect alibi. Since that time, when they decided to take a look at the case again in 2011, which, if you read my book, you'll see that there was a sheriff's department motive for that, other than trying to look into the truth. When they did that, they apparently contacted Walken's people, and Walken, with his lawyer, in 1981, when he was interviewed the second time, he had a criminal defense lawyer with him. And I bet that when he went in 2011, he had one as well. But he gave a statement to the sheriff's department. And I tried to get that statement with a lawsuit and was denied the statement under the law. Now, Walken has said a couple of times that he wants the truth out there, that it was just an accident. But he had a deal with the sheriff's department that they would never reveal what he said to the media before he talked to them. And they told me that's one of the reasons why they couldn't give it to me.
I had spoken with Dennis DeVerne on the phone for about 2 hours. I think I had mentioned to you I was trying to get him on my show. There was just some things I needed clarity on when it came to him being in the room of the hotel with Natalie Wood, what they talked about. He expressed that she was very frustrated and was dead set on leaving Wagner, divorcing him, and just that's the end of everything, which we've talked about in past episodes. But he mentioned another author, and I think the reason why he didn't do my show was that he asked her about me, and she said no because she saw I had spoken to you. And I wanted to ask about this gatekeeping that went on in the Natalie Wood case. We all care about truth, right, and media representation, but it seems like if they're not accepting a paycheck, they're not going to speak about it. And that's a problem. And you've kindly came on here and talked to me multiple times about the case, free. Only thing I'm taking your time away from you right now. But you've openly done it because you have done extensive work into the case and you are fighting for justice. You're still writing letters to DAs every couple of months, bringing, hey, the issue up to raise of that they need to start probing more.
Well, Robbie, most unfortunately with Dennis DeVerne, that's what it's come to. He doesn't open his mouth on any kind of show, first of all, unless he's paid. the last time I had anything to do with dealing with whether or not he would talk to me, he had an agent, and he spoke to me through his agent. So if he appears on a show, I'm sure he's got a contract with an agent, and he can't go on the show unless the agent agrees to it, and the agent's not going to agree to it unless you pay money for it. I have never asked for one penny. Anytime anybody wants to talk to me about my investigation in Natalie Wood's case, I agree to it. I don't care what kind of questions they ask me. But Dennis DeVerne, I'm sure, looked into you and knew, his people knew, that you asked hard questions and that you weren't going to throw him any softballs and that you were going to try to get down to the bottom of the truth of things. Because Dennis DeVerne, while Dennis DeVerne's core statements, I believe, are truthful and are corroborated about what happened Saturday night, Dennis DeVerne knows more than he's told people. I guarantee you he does. He has not told the entire truth. And anyway, it's too bad that it's gotten down to that. But like I said, and they've got their hand out every time somebody wants to talk to them about it.
Did you ever think it was suspicious that Wagner invited the 16-year-old Dennis DeVerne, or however old he was, onto the trip? Because if you're premeditating it, I mean, you could say that it could be Wood and Walken would be the people if you believe Wagner was behind it. But then was this kid, or Dennis DeVerne, when I asked him, he stated he had no idea why they would invite him on there. Maybe because they just didn't know anything about boats. But he said it was suspicious to him, but he did everything Wagner said.
Well, I never thought it was suspicious that Dennis DeVerne was on the trip because he was the captain of the boat. I mean, if I'm a big movie star and I've got a yacht and I've got a captain and I want to go to Catalina Island on a not very nice weekend, I'm not going to leave my captain at home. I'm going to take my captain with me. I mean, the water was rough. Plus, if you don't have your captain, you have to drive the boat. There's no time for any kind of socialization or anything like that. And I don't think that Wagner would have wanted to drive the boat and leave Natalie and Walken alone, because that was his big problem during the trip, mainly, as Natalie was spending too much time with Walken. And he didn't like that.
But clearly, as we've discussed in the past, Wagner tried multiple times to move the boat to the isthmus, to a more secluded part.
He did. And that was what the fight was about Friday night. He wanted that boat in a desolate area. Now, the question is, why? Was it because he had something in his mind that was planned with respect to dealing with Natalie and Walken? Or did he just want to be away from everybody so people wouldn't see Natalie's giving so much attention to Christopher Walken? I don't really know the answer. I mean, I have a great suspicion that Wagner did have something on his mind. Now, whether it include murdering Natalie Wood, I can't say that that's the case. But it is very suspicious that he would want to move the yacht, particularly with the weather the way it was, from Avalon. The cove there, or bay there, is a lot calmer than down at the isthmus. If you've ever been to Catalina Island and gone to the isthmus, when you get about a quarter of a mile from the isthmus and you turn the corner and head into the bay there, the wind just hits you in the face. One of my witnesses called it the Catalina Island, no, the Isthmus breeze, he called it, the Isthmus breeze, sarcastically. The wind's blowing all the time. So that's also the same thing with Davern being, the captain of the boat. I mean, he knew more about mooring the boat and making sure that it was in a position where it wouldn't get dinged up by other boats or get in some kind of trouble or something than Wagner did. I mean, Wagner certainly knew things about the boat, but he didn't know as much about it as Davern did. But it's very, very, very suspicious that he was pressing from the get-go to move the boat to a desolate area of the island.
Even with Davern's statements, despite what he said, he hasn't, like you mentioned, he's still got more he probably knows. I was able to get a few things from him just in context of certain things that we weren't there. It was only him or Natalie Wood or him and Wagner that I needed some context for. But to me, it's been a concern as if he knows more, he hasn't said more. And he's kind of back and forth or been silent. And obviously, in this case, we have to look at witnesses because the forensics, everything, it's all way after the fact. So we need more context to certain things we don't have answers to, which would either come from Davern, Wagner, or Walken. Like, how did Wagner end up on that pier? How was he there waiting? I don't understand. Like, there's a lot of things where the story seems chopped up, and it's like, to get answers from these people is what we need. And I don't know how else to do it by then just calling and asking. And if they refuse to do it, you don't have answers.
Well, that's right. There are holes. I mean, I will conceitedly admit that in my investigation, there were holes and there were things that I just couldn't fill in. I'll give you an example. I know that there were calls made from the yacht to the mainland. Now, in 1981, we didn't have cell phones. There wasn't anything like that, but they did have radio phones, and they were expensive. But the Wagners had one on the yacht. And I know that he made calls. Davern's even said that he made calls to the mainland. And he said the first call was to Wagner's lawyer. Well, I wanted to get the records. But of course, without a subpoena, there was no way that the phone companies were going to search for records, particularly back that far. That was back when Bell Telephone, owned everything. And they owned this particular setup that they had in Los Angeles. And they had people at switchboards. And I did find some documentation, some documentary stuff that would confirm that they did have these radio phones, and that people on the mainland would get a call and they would patch them through to whoever they were calling. And then there's a record of it, and they're charged for it. So back to the point, there are a lot of holes that need to be filled in, and Davern and Walken could fill them in if they were being totally truthful.
If we're relying on witnesses, when and how did you find your witnesses that overheard the screaming in the middle of the night?
Well, that's kind of interesting too. On Marilyn Wayne, for instance, she's one of the people that heard the lady in the water screaming, the woman in the water screaming for help and saying she was drowning. She was on there with her fiance, John Payne, and Marilyn's 8-year-old boy. They were engaged to be married, but they never got married. And so when I started looking for Marilyn Wayne, she was still called Marilyn Wayne. She hadn't remarried or married anyone else. And I found an address for Marilyn Wayne. I didn't even know it was her. I just had a driver take me over to her house, and I just walked up to the door and knocked on the door and said, "Are you Marilyn Wayne? I'm writing a book about Natalie Wood's death." And here's what she said to me after she invited me in. She said, and she was as serious as she could be, "I thought you came to kill me." That is how afraid that Marilyn Wayne has been over the years when it comes to speaking out about Robert Wagner and this screaming in the water. Now, her fiance has corroborated what she said. So it's not just Marilyn saying this, it's two witnesses. Now, he refused to talk to me. He said, "Well, I've talked to the sheriff's office, and that's all I'm going to do." But she was kind enough to let me in, but she was still afraid of repercussions, physical repercussions, when I went to see her in 2015, I believe it was.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask if we could return to DeVerne for just one moment. I'm curious, I was a police officer for a number of years, and I've taken the oath many times, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I'm wondering if you were to take his body of statements over the years, if that were to be representative of what he might say in a court hearing, how impeachable do you believe his testimony would be where he is leaving things out?
Well, you are exactly right, Brad. I mean, if this thing actually ever, if there was actually ever a trial, which there can never be anymore because of Wagner's age and infirmity and witnesses that have died off and evidence that's been lost. The only thing that's viable is an inquest, a coroner's inquest. And that's why I've been writing to the DA, Brad, because the DA under California law, all he has to do is write a one-sentence letter to the coroner and say, "I want an inquest on Natalie Wood's death," and it has to happen under law. So I've been writing to him and the sheriff as well. He can do the same thing. And I've been writing for almost 2 years, a letter every 2 months. And I'm going to write, I've told people, I'm going to write until I die or they have a coroner's inquest, one or the other. I've actually sent a copy to the letter to the DA's opponent and told him in the letter, the DA, that I was going to send a contribution to his opponent because I couldn't get him to respond, which I did. So back to your point, back to the point. When it comes to Davern, if he was on the stand under oath in a trial, okay, and subject to cross-examination, there would be a whole lot of things that could be used to impeach his testimony, including how drunk he was. But if you're a good prosecutor, you know that. And what you try to do, Brad, and you know this, is you try to corroborate everything that came out of Davern's mouth. That's why when Davern says there was a screaming, cussing, banging fight, you then come with forensics and show that Natalie Wood had Tardieu spots on her lungs. And have an expert say, "Well, how do you get Tardieu spots?" "Well, you can get them from screaming too much." Then you show the bruise on the forearm that was half as long as Natalie's forearm. I mean, we're talking it had to be at least 5 or 6 inches long across her forearm. And you ask the forensic pathologist, what is the customary and consistent thing that people do when they're in a fight? They raise their forearm. What is that called? A defensive wound.
Defensive wound.
That's what you do with DeVerne. But yes, back to the point. If I'm a defense attorney, I'm salivating because Dennis DeVerne has made so many inconsistent statements and exaggerated things in the last few years, I think, basically to promote himself and Marty Rooley and to make money. He's exaggerated the facts. And in my book, I point that out. I show where he's exaggerated facts, which are just totally untruthful. So there's a lot of things out there that you could use to impeach him. Yes.
Thank you.
Do you have any more, Brad?
Would that have changed the impeachability, if that's even a word? Would that change in a coroner's inquest? I've never been part of a coroner's inquest. I've been part of court proceedings, but would he be harder to impeach or easier to impeach in this inquest that you're pushing for?
Well, here's the deal about a coroner's inquest. It's not a trial. There are no evidence rules in a coroner's inquest. The coroner's inquest can be in front of a jury or it can be in front of a panel, 3 coroners. The coroners are the ones that ask the questions, unless they appoint a manager, so to speak, of the inquest, which, by the way, I want everybody to know I have volunteered to do at my expense. As a matter of fact, I even told the coroner I'd pay for the inquest. I will pay the expenses personally of an inquest if you give it. So it won't cost the Los Angeles County a dime. I'll pay for it, and I will handle it. I will handle it. You can have physicians there if you want, but I'll handle the inquest. So if you have a manager of the inquest, Brad, there's no cross-examination. There's no direct testimony and cross-examination testimony. There's a manager presenting evidence to an inquest jury. Now, an inquest jury doesn't find guilt. They don't make a finding of, we find so-and-so guilty of murdering Natalie Wood. What they find is this. They have 3 choices: suicide, accident, or death at the hands of another. And that's what I want this to finally end up being. And on Natalie's death certificate, I want it to say she was killed at the hands of another. And then we'll let people read my book and figure out who that person might be.
Would the notes that you received about Christopher Walken's changing statements be circumstantial evidence that could be submitted in a court or subpoena him to go to court?
Yes. Yeah, it would. Yeah, if you subpoenaed him to court, I mean, all of Christopher Walken's statements to the press and in media interviews, they would all be subject to being exposed in a courtroom. And let me say something else. If somebody writes a book, and we just had some of that in Donald Trump's trial. If somebody writes a book, what they say in the book is admission against interest. So it's admissible as evidence. It's not hearsay. It's not hearsay because they are, number one, on trial, and number two, there's an exception to the hearsay rule that is an admission against interest. And that would be what the statements would be in the book. So all those things would be subject to coming out in a courtroom if there was a trial, not an inquest.
Now, I know you have a petition that people can sign, but is there any way that we can get something or a statement or a trial or actual conclusion proceeding whether it's for your point or against your point, with Wagner, Walken, and Dennis DeVerne. Um, I would think that this would be a large interest to a lot of the people that are still active and very community based in trying to understand and have their own conclusion that Wagner or whoever was behind the death of Natalie Wood.
Well, now, okay. Once again, Robbie, there could never be a trial. And the reason why there could never be a trial is that the DA would have to file charges against Robert Wagner or indict him with the grand jury. And then they have to go to court and prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, there have been so many witnesses that have died, like the pathologists. All the pathologists are gone. They're all, well, back up. Choi and Rosenblum, I believe his name was, they have passed away. Dr. Noguchi lives in Japan, and he's 90. I think that Dr. Noguchi might be somewhere like 96 years old. So you'd have to get him out of Japan, which would probably be impossible. And then secondly, I mean, what's his mental state like now? I mean, would Dr. Noguchi even be able to remember that he performed an autopsy on Natalie Wood? I don't know. But you've got the trial, and then the other vehicle that's a legal vehicle is an inquest. And it's totally different from a trial. It's like an administrative hearing where people do come and testify. Now, the manager can bring people to testify and put them under oath. So if Wagner was competent, he could be subpoenaed to the trial, to an inquest. And so could Walken, and so could Davern. They're put under oath. But the questions that are asked of them are asked by the manager of the inquest, not a prosecutor and a defense attorney. You follow me?
Yeah. A lot of our past episodes, we've dived more in depth so people can just listen back to those. I wanted this one to be focused on things I haven't asked, which is what's the most infuriating thing for you about doing all this work? And we might not ever have closure or conclusion based on the evidence. I don't see Wagner getting up on the stand and openly admitting to anything, or Dennis DeVerne. And would you trust his statements considering how much he's, changed and gone for a paycheck or something like that?
Well, I here's what I think. What I think the most frustrating thing is about this to me is that the mainstream media has allowed things to be presented on TV that are either puff pieces for Robert Wagner or that do not dive into these known details that I have in my book. And just to show you how frustrating it's been, after my book was published, I sat down and sent a copy of my book to every major news media outlet in the United States of America, including Geraldo Rivera. And I didn't hear from one of them. Not one of them contacted me. Now, why is that? Personally, I think it's all about Christopher Walken and the fact that Christopher Walken is still alive, and this would not be too good for Christopher Walken's legacy if he finally disclosed the truth to the American public, which, in my opinion, he doesn't have the character to do. He's never going to do it. So unless they have an inquest out in California and he gets subpoenaed to testify under oath, you're never going to hear the truth out of Wagner, and you're never going to hear the truth out of DeVerne. Because keep in mind, DeVerne has never testified under oath. None of them have. They've never given statements under oath. They've all lied. Wagner lied to the sheriffs. DeVerne lied to the sheriffs. Walken lied to the sheriffs. And in 1981, that was the crime, in my opinion. In California, the statute of limitations, of course, expired on it. But they've all given false statements to various and sundry news outlets and media and things like that. But they've never been under oath, subject to the penalty of perjury. That means this: if you testify under oath and testify about something that happened in 1981 and it turns out to be a lie, you can be prosecuted for perjury. So it would be very important to get them under oath. But the only way that I think that if people really want to help get this done, go on change.org and sign my petition. Every time I send a letter, I send them the names. I'm now over 2,000 signatures on this change.org petition to have an inquest. And so every time I write a letter, I'm going to tell them, this is how many people out there have signed this from all over the world. You need to have an inquest. And I'm gonna keep on them, and that's really all we can do is keep on them. But back to the frustration, it's the mainstream media. They don't. It's like they want to keep this a mystery. And personally, when you read my book, it's no more of a mystery. It's not a mystery anymore. If there was a trial in 2011 when they reopened the case and I was the prosecutor and I had the evidence available to me in 2011, I believe I could have convicted Robert Wagner of second-degree murder. But now here we are, 2024, 13 years later, more witnesses have died, more evidence is lost. It's getting very, very difficult to do that. So that's where my frustration comes from. I can't get the DA to do anything or the coroner to do anything, and I can't get the mainstream media to do anything because they could put heat on the DA too, But
well, they'll just stick around for anniversary events when it comes to Natalie Wood, and they'll do puff pieces on that.
Yes, that's it. Anniversary puff pieces. Let's have a documentary where we're all going to think we're going to hear the truth out of Robert Wagner, and all we get is a couple softball questions
and maybe a couple scenes from Goldmember.
Yes.
Brad, do you have any questions for him before I wrap up?
That's right.
I do not. Thank you, Robbie.
I want to give you the time, much like you've given us the time today, Mr. Perroni, to promote your links, anywhere people can find your links. And then, Brad, I'll have you list off anything for you briefly, and then we'll close out.
Well, thank you very much, Robbie. I would appreciate it. Yes, you can go if someone wants to. For instance, I have a hardback book that's for sale on Amazon. And by the way, there it is. All my author profits are going to charity in Natalie's memory. I am not going to make one dime off of Natalie Wood's death. Number two, you can buy a paperback if you go to my website, which is NatalieWoodBrainstorm.com. NatalieWoodBrainstorm.com. And you can buy a paperback there. And if you go to my website, you're going to find a lot more information about a whole lot of different things, as well as an index to my book. We didn't include an index because it was going to make the book too long. So the index is on my website, which will help you find things in the book a lot easier if you want. And then the last thing is go to change.org, and all you got to do is punch in Sam Perroni or coroner inquest, and my petition will pop up. go on there and sign the petition, leave a comment if you want, and help me promote that petition and get as many signatures as possible.
Brad?
This is a little bit unrelated to what we've been speaking of, but my links are I'm on Amazon. It's a Kindle. First on the Scene, Dallas Parkland Hospital Doctors and the Assassination of John Kennedy. And it's also available from jfklancer.com.
I'll make sure I link all those links in the description. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure chatting with both of you, and thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast. If you're looking to sign Sam's petition, the link will be in the description, episode details on both Spotify and YouTube. Please, if you can, take the second and sign that petition. Thank you, and thank you for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast.